eu não confio na democracia brasileira. Isso que está aqui na democracia, isso aqui é uma bagunça. Tanto é que a população diz abertamente que se vivia muito melhor no regime militar do que... Favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso. E o povo é favorável a isso também.
This is Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil, and everything that's happening in Brazil right now centers around him. But there's a much deeper story to all this than the media lets on. In this video, we're going to look at how we got here, why this is happening, and why this is important for you. Stay tuned. Inflation is killing us all. If only there was a way to buy the same things at a cheaper price. With ExpressVPN, you can change your location to a cheap country like Brazil and buy Netflix, Spotify, or plane tickets at a cheaper price than in your home country. So if you want to fight inflation and help out the channel, as well as getting 50% off and 3 months extra free of ExpressVPN, go to expressvpn.com/mytake. Link in the description. Back to the video. January 6th, 2.0. This is what Brazil's Congress looked like on January 7th. And this is what Brazil's Congress looked like on January 8th, when thousands of Bolsonaro supporters stormed the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace in a violent attack on Brazilian democracy. The Bolsonaristas, echoing the rhetoric of their leader, refused to accept the election results and refused to accept the legitimacy of democratically elected left-wing president Lula da Silva. Not only did they storm the 3 pillars of Brazilian democracy, but many of them camped outside of military barracks and the army headquarters and called for a military coup to overthrow the democratically elected government and install Bolsonaro. How did this happen? It would seem that after the January 6th insurrection in the United States, leaders across the world are copying Trump's playbook. Claim the elections are rigged, even though you're in power. Refuse to accept the results when you lose, and then incite your supporters to a riot. And so it was with Bolsonaro. 4 months before the election, Brazil's right-wing president Jair Bolsonaro claimed that even though he was in power, the left-wing opposition, which is not in power and does not control any electoral institutions, would somehow rig the election through the electronic voting system. The message to his supporters was clear. If I win, it's fair. If I lose, it's rigged. The October 2022 election pitted the pro-business, pro-military, pro-gun, anti-environment, tough-on-crime Bolsonaro against the pro-worker, pro-environment, pro-redistribution, pro-indigenous Lula da Silva. And as fortune would have it, Lula won by a razor-thin margin, 50.9% to Bolsonaro's 49.1%. Bolsonaro refused to concede defeat and promptly left for Florida. Meanwhile, his campaign went to the Supreme Court to overturn the results. They produced no evidence for fraud. The Supreme Court threw out their case and fined Bolsonaro's campaign $4 million for wasting their time. But it didn't stop there. The weeks running up to Lula's inauguration saw clear signals of the violence that was to come. Incited by Bolsonaro's claims of fraud, his hardcore supporters began camping outside army headquarters and military barracks, calling for the military to overturn the election. Thousands of pro-Bolsonaro truckers began blockading the streets in over a dozen Brazilian states. On 13 December, Bolsonaristas tried to storm the federal police headquarters in the capital Brasilia, torching buses and cars as they moved through the city. Just before Christmas, another extremist Bolsonaro supporter was arrested and confessed to a plot to bomb Brasilia's airport in an attempt to spark turmoil that might justify a military coup. And while all this was happening, some military generals expressed sympathy for the Bolsonaristas. General Eduardo Vilas-Boas, former head of the army, explicitly questioned the electoral process and claimed the protests in favor of a coup are merely a response to attacks on democracy. It was in this context that days after Lula had been inaugurated, thousands of Bolsonaristas stormed the heart of Brazilian democracy. They broke through the barricades and they began smashing up the Brazilian Congress. While in many ways there are parallels to January 6th, there are also differences. January 6th was designed to prevent the certification of the election results and directly involved Trump egging his supporters on. January 8th in Brazil, however, happened after Lula had already been inaugurated and Bolsonaro left the country, and Bolsonaro's stormed an empty Congress on a Sunday. Their aim was not to stop any legal process, but to get the military to launch a coup to overthrow a democratically elected president. And while they failed in this, there is evidence that elements of the security forces are sympathetic to the Bolsonaristas. Police and soldiers were caught taking selfies with rioters or even joining the insurrection. Off-duty soldiers were reportedly among the insurrectionists. The front door of the Congress was not broken, meaning that someone let them in. Brazilia's security chief decreased the number of police in Brasilia despite authorities knowing the protests were coming. And the military police took suspiciously long to respond to the riot. The riot could not have happened without the deliberate negligence and tacit support of the security forces. What's more, it's clear that this insurrection was well planned, funded, and coordinated. Unknown funders paid for buses to transport Bolsonaristas to the capital. And a police raid on Bolsonaro's former justice minister and Brasilia's security chief, André Torres, found a draft presidential decree that would have allowed Bolsonaro to declare a state of defense, to intervene in the superior electoral court to overturn the election. But the attempted insurrection failed. Ultimately, the armed forces largely remained loyal to the constitution. Pro-democracy counter-protesters began mobilizing onto the streets. World leaders condemned the insurrection. Brazilian media, which is normally pro-business, called the rioters terrorists. And most importantly, President Lula took swift action to stop the insurrection. After condemning the insurrection as the work of vandals and fascists, he immediately declared a 1-month federal intervention, announcing that he would identify the culprits, freeze the bank accounts of the insurrectionists, go after those who financed the insurrection, and punish the police and military officers who either collaborated with the rioters or were negligent in their response. So far, 1,500 people have been arrested, including Brasilia's pro-Bolsonaro security chief, and several government officials have been fired. Hoping to avoid culpability for the insurrection, Bolsonaro, still in Florida, called for an end to the riots, and his party announced that anyone involved in the riot would be removed from the party. But even after the riot, Bolsonaro continued to falsely insist that the election was rigged. He is now also under investigation. As we speak, the democratic constitutional order in Brazil has been restored. But this only explains the immediate causes of the insurrection. Bolsonaro has a history of anti-democratic politics going back decades, and the fact that such a leader could be elected in the first place has its roots in the deep structural problems of Brazilian politics. The rise of Bolsonarismo. To fully understand all this, we need to go back and understand how Bolsonaro was able to rise to power. Brazil is a deeply unequal and corrupt country. This is the direct legacy of slavery, military dictatorship, and an institutionalized oligarchy. This was even more so the case in 2002, when Lula da Silva, a union leader from the left-wing Workers' Party, was elected president with 61% of the vote. Previous leaders had focused on neoliberal economics, privatizing public services and slashing taxes and regulations for big business and the rich to achieve growth. But Lula tried something different. With commodity prices booming, the 2000s saw some of the highest rates of economic growth for Brazil, and the Workers' Party made sure that that growth would benefit the poor. Lula implemented a vast array of redistributive social welfare programs, including Bolsa Familia, that gave cash payments to poor families if they kept their children in school and got them vaccinated, mass housing programs to fix the favelas, a university scholarship program for low-income people that doubled the number of university students, infrastructure programs, and much more. The result? 23 million people were lifted out of poverty. 15.3 million jobs were created. Child malnutrition was cut by 46%. On top of that, Lula made sure to protect the environment, implementing a raft of laws to protect the Amazon rainforest and indigenous land, causing deforestation rates to to collapse. And this made the Workers' Party massively popular, winning 4 elections in a row. The first 2 terms under Lula da Silva, and then 2 more terms under his successor, Dilma Rousseff. For the first time in history, the working class was winning in Brazil. But it wouldn't last. In 2014, everything changed when Brazil was engulfed by the largest corruption scandal in Brazilian history. Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. In this scandal, it was uncovered that officials in the state-owned oil company Petrobras had accepted bribes from business people in exchange for overpriced contracts. But this corruption scandal soon grew to implicate hundreds of politicians and business people from across the political spectrum, including 3 former presidents. Over 429 people were indicted and 159 were convicted, and billions of dollars were stolen from the Brazilian people. While President Dilma Rousseff was never directly implicated in Operation Car Wash, she was impeached anyway for illegally manipulating the government budget. She was replaced by her center-right vice president, Michel Temer, who had a 2% approval rating. But as it turns out, he was later found guilty of leading an organized crime ring that accepted $470 million in bribes. And as this political crisis unfolded, every political party and politician was being discredited. Support for democracy fell from 54% in 2005 to just 32% in 2016. This unprecedented corruption crisis led to a wave of protests and a surge of discontent with the political establishment. But it wasn't the only crisis Brazil was facing. Since late 2013, the economy had slipped into recession and the country was engulfed in crime. In 2017, Brazil experienced over 64,000 murders, almost 4 times higher than the United States, and one of the highest in the world. For many people, the country seemed lawless, corrupt, and out of control, and it needed a strong leader to fix it. Enter Jair Bolsonaro. Having served as a member of Congress for decades, Bolsonaro had been a politician on the fringes of Brazilian politics, but that suddenly changed as he positioned himself as an anti-establishment outsider. He promised to restore law and order to the country. When it came to crime, he proposed that the police should just be allowed to execute criminals on the spot without trial. This in a country where, even before Bolsonaro, extrajudicial killings by the police were not uncommon. Now, of course, authoritarian measures like these extrajudicial killings also mean that the police are unaccountable and innocent people get killed, and it usually makes the violence worse. But in a country with 64,000 murders a year, that resonates. But besides these fascistic-sounding policies, Bolsonaro wasn't too keen on democracy either.
Eu não confio na democracia brasileira. Isso que está aqui na democracia, isso aqui é uma bagunça. Tanto é que a população diz abertamente que se vivia muito melhor no regime militar do...
You see, between 1964 and 1985, Brazil was ruled by a right-wing US-backed military dictatorship. That dictatorship was justified by the need to purge the country of an internal enemy, leftists, and maintain traditional Western values. And this was achieved by the mass torture of dissidents. People were subjected to electric shock treatment, had insects introduced into their bodies, and some were even crucified. But unlike in other countries, after the dictatorship, the military leaders were never properly punished or exposed for their crimes. So there's a prevailing myth among many Brazilians who did not directly experience torture or are too young to remember that this was a time of law and order and peace and prosperity. And it's this myth that would be exploited by Bolsonaro, who was an army captain during the military dictatorship. Rather than condemning the dictatorship, Bolsonaro said it didn't go far enough.
Através do voto, você não vai mudar nada nesse país. Tá? Nada, absolutamente nada. Você só vai mudar, infelizmente, quando um dia nós partimos para uma guerra civil aqui dentro. Né? E fazendo um trabalho que o regime militar não fez, matando uns 30 mil. Começando com o FHC. Não deixar para fora, não. Matando. Se vai morrer alguns inocentes.
But in a country with deep distrust in democratic institutions, that message landed. There was only one thing in the way of Bolsonaro claiming the presidency. Lula da Silva. Former presidents in Brazil can run for multiple non-consecutive terms, and in 2018, Lula was leading in the polls. But then, as part of Operation Car Wash, he was convicted on corruption charges and barred from running. And this forced the Workers' Party at the last minute to nominate the relatively unknown Fernando Haddad as their candidate. This anti-corruption crusade was led by popular judge Sergio Moro. As would later be revealed in leaked chats, Sergio Moro as a judge had secretly collaborated with the prosecutors and given strategic advice on how to convict Lula da Silva on corruption charges. This showed blatant malfeasance, as judges have to be neutral to preside over cases like this. These leaks show that Operation Car Wash was, in part, targeted at Lula to prevent a Workers' Party victory. As it would turn out, after 18 months in prison and well after the election, Lula was later acquitted on all charges. And so in 2018, after surviving an attempted assassination, Bolsonaro was elected with 55% of the vote. Trump of the Tropics. So what did Bolsonaro actually do in his presidency? Bolsonaro's support base is composed of 4 groups: conservative evangelical Christians, the business class, law and order anti-corruption voters, and the army. But the most important faction to securing his power was the military. Under Bolsonaro, a disturbing militarization of the government took place. Bolsonaro nominated 7 military commanders to his cabinet and appointed Military General Antonio Mourão as his vice president. Under his rule, 6,000 active military personnel were given jobs in non-military positions in government. In fact, there were more military personnel in Bolsonaro's government than under the military dictatorship. And to further shore up his military support, he increased salaries and benefits for the military and increased the military budget, while he cut funding for education in half. Bolsonaro ran as an anti-corruption candidate, even appointing Judge Sergio Moro as his Minister of Justice. Yet his administration was rife with corruption. When the head of Brazil's federal police was investigating his own sons for embezzlement and disinformation, Bolsonaro had him fired and replaced with his friend Alexandre Ramagem. Fortunately, the Supreme Court blocked him, and Bolsonaro came under investigation for obstruction of justice. Sergio Moro resigned in disgust. In another scandal, Bolsonaro's education minister, Milton Ribeiro, was arrested on charges of bribery and influence peddling in the distribution of public funds. And so more scandals have plagued his presidency. To satisfy big business, Bolsonaro quickly moved to reverse the left-wing policies of the Workers' Party. He appointed radical free market economist Paulo Guedes as finance minister, cut corporate taxes, rolled back workers' rights, and implemented pension reform. On a positive note, however, he raised the minimum wage and introduced incentives for green energy, eliminating all taxes on solar panels. However, because of inflation, the real minimum wage was actually lower at the end of Bolsonaro's presidency than at the start. But the biggest impact was on the environment. This is what happened to deforestation rates when Lula was in power. This is what happened to deforestation rates when Bolsonaro took control. This was the direct result of Bolsonaro's actions to starve the environmental agencies of funds, cut back on enforcement, and roll back the legal protections of the Amazon implemented under Lula. Agribusiness interests had taken over the environmental ministry, and the agencies responsible for deforestation, climate, and indigenous lands were gutted and had their functions moved to the agriculture ministry, which is also controlled by agribusiness. Land-hungry loggers, miners, and agribusiness began invading indigenous lands under Bolsonaro, knowing that they would not be punished. The net result? Deforestation soared to a 15-year high, with a direct impact on global carbon emissions. This is why Brazilian politics is important to you. But what really turned people against Bolsonaro was COVID. 700,000. That's how many Brazilians were killed by COVID. And while no leader responded perfectly to the virus, under Bolsonaro, Brazil had one of the highest COVID death rates on the planet. The reason? Bolsonaro. From the get-go, he downplayed the virus, calling it just a little flu, flouted social distancing measures, and threatened to withhold emergency COVID funding from states that imposed COVID restrictions. Instead, he promoted fake treatments like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and discouraged the use of masks or social distancing. And when his own health minister contradicted him by advocating for social distancing, Bolsonaro had him fired and replaced him with a military general with zero medical experience. Bolsonaro's botched response to the pandemic resulted in hundreds of thousands more dead and eventually turned much of the economic and military establishment against him, as well as the Brazilian people. Even so, he still retains a massive hardcore support base. So what happens now that Lula is back in power? Lula the Future. So what now? Can Lula fix the mess of Bolsonaro's presidency? Does he even have the backing to do so? The sad truth is that Lula will have a much harder time implementing pro-worker redistributive policies than he did in the 2000s. For starters, his mandate is much smaller. Previously, he won elections with over 60% of the vote, but this time he won by a razor-thin margin of 1.8%. Half the country loves him, and half the country wants the military to overthrow him from power. This gives him much less breathing room to implement a clear left-wing agenda. On top of that, while he won the presidency, the Workers' Party does not control Congress, which means that Lula will have to compromise with center-right pro-establishment parties who will water down his policies. Lula will face critical challenges to his authority as well. The Bolsonaristas have shown that they can disrupt his presidency at any time, and the questionable loyalty of the security forces is a real threat to his government. Just 9% of Brazilians trust their politicians, while trust in the military is 3 times higher. On top of that, the economic conditions in Brazil today are much worse than in the 2000s, making it more difficult to finance ambitious programs. But there are also positives. The Bolsonarista riot has been condemned right across the political spectrum, even begrudgingly by Bolsonaro himself. Unlike in America, the Brazilian government and parties both on the right and the left are taking swift action to punish the insurrectionists and those who organized and funded them. Even Bolsonaro is not immune to prosecution now that he has lost his presidential immunity and is currently under investigation. Decisive action to punish the insurrectionists and those who funded them will deter any future coup attempts. Although Lula may have to tread carefully to prevent a right-wing backlash in Brazil's highly polarized society. However, Brazilian society is at least temporarily uniting behind Lula, with 76% of Brazilians against the insurrection and 50% holding Bolsonaro responsible for the riots. This means that Bolsonaro has little chance of leading an effective opposition against Lula. So what can we expect? Lula has laid out 2 main priorities: economic reform and environmental reform. Bolsonaro has left Brazil's economy in a decrepit state. Economic growth has slowed to just 1.7%, and under his presidency, the national debt reached its highest level ever, and is currently at 75% of GDP, and the fiscal deficit is at 4.2% of GDP. Lula aims to bring back economic stability and try to help the poor. He plans to close the fiscal hole by reversing some of Bolsonaro's corporate tax cuts, raising taxes on the rich, and increasing enforcement of the tax law. At the same time, Lula plans to increase cash transfers to the poor, expand the social housing program, and introduce a debt forgiveness program. He also wants to use government banks to invest in the economy in areas ranging from small business to green energy. Despite these proposals, Lula's economic policy will be less left-wing than in the past, as he is constrained by a center-right vice president and centrist coalition partners. Only 27% of his cabinet actually comes from the Workers' Party. On top of that, since 2016, Brazil has a 20-year constitutional cap on government spending, limiting what programs Lula can finance. As a result, his proposals are more focused on balancing the budget. And while he's against privatizing existing state companies like Petrobras, Brazil's oil company, he is not going to renationalize companies that were already privatized previously, like Eletrobras, the national electricity company. As Brazil goes, so goes the climate. This is why Brazilian politics is important to you. The survival of the Amazon rainforest, the world's largest carbon sink, depends on who governs in Brasilia. While under Bolsonaro, deforestation accelerated to the highest levels in 15 years, Lula plans to change that with the Brazilian Green New Deal. 500,000 square kilometers of the Amazon rainforest will be placed under protected status. That's an area the size of Spain. Funding for Brazil's environmental protection agencies will be increased, enforcement of environmental laws will be increased, and subsidies and tax incentives will be introduced for sustainable farming and green energy, protecting both Brazil's forests and the indigenous people who live in them. These policies will be difficult to implement. Powerful agribusiness and logging interests want to continue deforestation to clear land for agriculture and timber, and half of the Brazilian Congress belongs to the Farm Caucus, which is beholden to the agribusiness lobby. But if Lula is able to implement these policies, it would form a critical component of the fight against global warming. What happens in Brazil matters. It matters because Brazil is the third largest economy in the Western Hemisphere. It matters because Brazil is the world's carbon sink. And it matters because what happens in Brazil can happen here too. If you enjoyed this video and want to support more content like this, consider becoming a Patreon or signing up for ExpressVPN using the link below. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons including Linda, Richard and many more for making this video possible. Like, share and subscribe, because this was my take.